Jesus said to his disciples, when the Son of Man comes in his glory. So again, this return of Jesus. And whether Jesus actually said these words, we're not entirely sure. Because the early church, from right after the death and resurrection of Jesus until the last piece in the New Testament was written and edited, they were dealing with this idea that Jesus would return very quickly. So we are not sure whether Jesus would have said these words or whether that's the way the gospel writers framed it to bring about this idea that folks get prepared for the end.
But isn't all of the scriptures, aren't they all the inspired word of God and meant to be taken verbatim? Some would argue, well, no, of course Jesus said this because it says, then Jesus said. I think that's something that we hear every now and then. You say, well, Jesus wouldn't have said this or that. And I think that some of us feel, well, how could that be? Could you go maybe just a little deeper into that?
Take the way the third servant was treated in the past Sunday's gospel. Now, throw this useless servant into the darkness outside where there will be wailing and grinding of teeth. Would Jesus say that? We need to be clear. Is God violent? Is Jesus violent? And if we say yes to either one or both, then that gives us the freedom to be as violent as we want to be, because we're only living in imitation of the God who created us and the one who came to reveal who God is. So we have to make that clear distinction, and that takes a lot of interpretation, a lot of very careful study to come to the conclusion that God was not violent, even though in the Old Testament there is much violence attributed to God, like the destruction of the Egyptians, for instance. And the whole idea that here are the Egyptians, bad people, and then there's the Israelites, good people, God's on their side against the Egyptians. Well, that was the understanding of the people at the time. I mean, it was a huge movement to come to the point that God was in favor of people who were not being treated appropriately. That was the idea. And we know from the study of archaeology and all kinds of other studies, the plagues that God supposedly brought on the Egyptians are all natural phenomena. Same with the passage of Sodom and Gomorrah. From what I understand, it was a lightning storm that, and the kind of rocks that were there, when the lightning hit the rocks, they exploded and perhaps even burned, were on fire. And so this fire was just like fireworks all over the place and uncontrollable. So we need to be very, very careful that, again, God did not necessarily directly or even have any influence in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it certainly had nothing to do with people's sexual preference. It had to do with a lack of hospitality. That was the sin.